There was a video, and we'll play it later. But it was a press conference, and I think this is where this came out, where the admiral who's in charge of procurement and sort of, I guess, overseeing the distribution of stuff, basically revealed that what we're doing as a government is that we are sourcing personal protection equipment, ventilators around the world. We're bringing it back to the States, and then we're giving it to private companies to resell to the states that need it. Like, I can't even, I'm almost having trouble retelling this without getting really angry.
It's one of the most ongoing shocking things. Like, there's been so many shocking things and so many screw ups that are so egregious and have been so horrible and are caused so much more misery and sickness and death. But the ongoing one, which is that there is a completely insane haywire market for the needed equipment that the federal government refuses to just kind of move into and essentially nationalize and regularize. And instead, they're playing this weird kind of like, sometimes they're a bidder, sometimes they're a kind of facilitator, the middleman. I've had all these conversations with procurement officials and state of procurement folks in state offices and with governors themselves. We had a governor, I won't say his name, but there was a governor who was going to come on the other night and had to cancel last minute because there was like a shipment that was rolling up to his state of like masks, and then like they weren't there. And so, and there's all these super dodgy middlemen, like there's these like sketchy Ukrainians running around who are like selling up. It is totally nuts. And the federal government is just letting this haywire market go haywire. New York Times had that story about how New York paid 15 times the index price for a bunch of stuff. It's like, you can't, it's like, after a hurricane, if someone's charging $9 a gallon for gas, like this, the government comes in and says, you can't do that. And we're not doing that here. They're just letting it run amok. And it's like, the federal government, I keep thinking about this thing Ron Klain said to me, who is the Ebola czar among many jobs he had in the federal government, where he said that like we have an Articles of Confederation response here from the federal government. Like, it's as if we don't have a federal government and a constitution. It's just kind of like, hey, states, figure it out. We're here. We'll give you some guidance. Maybe we'll throw you a ventilator here or there, but like there's just zero actual federal like leadership or coordination happening.
Jared Kushner came out and said, look, they have their supplies and we have ours. And it's like, who is ours?
It's ours. It's ours. It's yours, the Kushner family, you and Ivanka, your personal household stash. What does ours mean? Like the members of the union, I think, the 50 states that constitute the government in the document we call the Constitution. I think that's who it is.
If I just to go back to my understanding of what that general said at this press conference, it sounds like we are expending U.S. taxpayer dollars through the military or whatever apparatus we're using to source this material. We are
facilitate private purchases and profit making.
Yes.
That is what is happening.
This is bad crap. This is insanity. This is, this is beyond incompetence.
The other thing about it is there's a bunch of complicated problems here, right? There's like a foreign supply chain. There's the ramping up domestic production. But even if you say, okay, look, the nature of the fact that a lot of this stuff is sourced foreign and we can't just, obviously the federal government can't like nationalize a foreign enterprise's mass production, right? But what you can do is just say, like, look, we're going to make this a very simple market where there is one buyer, which is the federal government.
Yes.
And we're not going to we're just going to come in and say, we're now the buyer. There's a single buyer market. We are buying. And that would give them a lot of price control because you would get rid of competition. You would push the price down and then you would regularize the whole thing. So I get that there's a certain kind of, there's some aspect of this is going to be price sensitive and market driven because the foreign producers, you can't nationalize. You can't just, step in and say, this is what's happening. But if you're going to play that game, then the federal government should be doing it rather than facilitating what Cuomo, I think, rightly called an eBay auction.
And then it appears that once we have, as a government, sourced this stuff and essentially given it to private enterprise to resell, they don't even necessarily have to resell it to the United States. They're turning around. They're selling it back to the people that we sourced it from.
There's crazy stuff happening where like countries are bidding against each other. So like a plane is about to like come down and then it like turns around. I saw this story the other day. Like, well, we got one that France was supposed to get. Like, it's just like so out of control nuts.
And just to be clear, this is beyond incompetence, right? I mean, I saw an interview that I think, I think a guy from CBS did in his kitchen with that guy Beauregard, who was the general they brought down to deal with Katrina when everything was a mess. And he was apoplectic. He's like, I've never seen anything like this in my 50 years doing this.
There's two levels.
He said somebody's got to go to jail for this.
Yes, there are three levels here. There's incompetence. So there's incompetence, which is just good faith incompetence. And that's happening a lot. Like, for instance, I think what you're going to see roll out with this SBA program, I know people at the SBA who are trying to get this thing up and running, who are good people, who want this to work, and it's just going to be a mess, right? So that's just...
I want to talk about that in a minute, but yeah.
Yeah, so there's some... Then there is abdication, which is worse than incompetence, which is what is happening broadly. There's just abdication. It's not that they're trying and failing. It's that they are saying you're on your own. Like, we're just not going to do this because, and it all comes back to this sort of plausible deniability. Like Donald Trump fundamentally, and this is a thing I think that in some ways, in certain ways has saved us from worse kind of strongman authoritarian impulses. Fundamentally, he just wants to be the guy on Fox and Friends calling in to second guess. He doesn't actually want to be in charge and have the responsibility. And you're seeing that in this crisis. He's sort of A/B testing responses. Oh, it's a war. Oh, we're getting back to work by Easter. Oh, it's on the states. He doesn't actually want the responsibility of leadership. So what he wants to do is just be like to second guess everyone and kind of come out and do his sales spiel and not actually have control and authority and command, because then that gives him responsibility, which is like the last thing in the world he wants. So there's abdication, and then there's vendetta, right? There's the like, don't talk to the governor of Michigan because that lady wasn't nice to me, or like New York healthcare workers are stealing masks, so they're not going to get them. So there's like these ascending levels of horror here in the response, from like the lowest level being good faith and competence. That's like the best version of the things that are happening.
Well,
and then all the way up to like, oh, like you are pursuing a vendetta, a petty vendetta that will end up with people dead.
But let me also interject. I think there's another one in there, and I think that the fundamentally, and I guess maybe just my time having lived up in a small town for a couple of years, I got a better notion of this, of watching people get into politics because they perceive it as an extension of their business. That I'm going to become a county supervisor. I'm going to sit on this board because I'm going to be able to throw low cost loans to my friend who has a food distribution company or whatever it is. And he's going to kick back to me some business from my accounting firm or whatever it is.
Yep.
And I think, what's clear to me, and I think I think at one point we're going to find out the reason why we didn't take that German test that the World Health Organization was distributing was just because there were too many moneyed interests who were like, oh, I want to be the guy who makes them here because I'm going to sell, 100 million of these units and I'm going to make $1 billion.
Yeah, there are all sorts of like we don't have yet, because of the flurry of activity, like the reporting to bear out what all the money and interests are doing and all the corruption, like specifically. But there are just so many opportunities for corruption here and so even like I keep being like the hydroxychloroquine or whatever, like, which again, like there has been a little bit of promise in that. There's been some studies, but like you keep asking, like, does he know a person who's invested in it? Like, it's just,
right.
Everything comes, you got to ask this sort of simple cui bono question, because the guy is obviously like just insanely corrupt. And all the people, the thing about him too, the thing that we learned from like those Lev Parnas tapes is, and it's one of the sort of features of the presidency, is that it's so easy to get to the president.
Right.
So it's like some dude who's got like who's banking big on this drug because he's invested or he's got whatever can get in the president's ear and so it's just this vector for corruption all the time, even if the president is naive to the corrupt purpose, right?
Yep.
Even if he's not in on it, it's just so easy to like come in with your sales pitch of some ridiculous thing that you're trying to make money on, a Ukrainian gas pipeline, a drug treat, like that's just so. Throughout all this, I just keep thinking of all the opportunities. You know, there was a Times article today that it was like Daniel Boulud was the one who got in his ear about restoring the tax exemption for business lunches. Remember that? He did that the other day? Like, very randomly was like, we got to go back to the good old days where you could like expense a 3 martini lunch. And then today the reporting was like, yeah, Daniel Boulud got in his ear about that. Like, the amount of people getting to him to push whatever freaking crazy private interest right now is just staggering to contemplate.
Right. I mean, we saw something with Jared Kushner is going to benefit mightily from the provision of
the real estate,
of real and of landlords of low income housing, getting special favors essentially. Which obviously you want to you want to keep people from being evicted. But I can imagine what those provisions look like because they're tailor-made for his interests. So let's talk about, just to transition just a little bit, as to what you think the Democrats are doing at this point, because it seems to me, I mean, I can understand on some level, I have some sympathy for the political argument of like, you don't want to be out there going full hog with congressional investigations right now at a time of crisis. On the other hand, maybe you do, or at the very least,
I mean, I'm definitely in the maybe you do category. I mean, my bigger concern is just the, well, there's a lot of concern.
You need a deterrent at the very least. Never mind accountability, which could come later.
You need this stuff to work. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, no one is rooting for any of this to fail, right? Like, it's like, we're all in the same boat. There's no like them over there. There's like, it's like, I want like the paycheck protection program, which I think actually is a reasonably well designed or at least conceived idea. Like, I want it to work, and I'm very scared it won't. And so you need members of Congress to be, being the oversight to make sure it works. So just at a sort of substantive level of like, let's get like, for instance, you need members of Congress to be beating the crap out of the IRS to say 5 months is too long for the check. Like,
and just to be clear to everybody, it like supposedly literally takes a week to physically cut 20 million checks. Yeah. And you just do the math. If we're talking 100 million Americans, that means 5 weeks. If we're talking 200 million Americans, that means 10 weeks. If we're talking 300 million Americans, that's 15 weeks to get people that money if they don't have an account on IRS. I mean, that was the idea behind the debit card, right?
Again, I don't want to, all this stuff, I don't want to minimize the sheer logistical bureaucratic challenges of all this stuff, which, my wife worked in the White, like I've been around people who work in government my whole life. My father's a civil servant. Like, this stuff it's not like a layup. This is hard stuff. Right. But like, this is genuinely hard, unprecedented stuff. All this stuff is new. It hasn't been done before. But so the first level that you want Congress active and aware is just to make sure implementation works, because otherwise, like, it's going to be a disaster. So before you even get to like the politics of it and the politics of Trump's response, which, to be honest, I think are important, but also like I naively maybe think that the truth will out in the end. Like, this has been such a disaster. I just think that it hasn't quite dawned on people what a disaster it is. So like the political calculation there to me is almost secondary to just the substantive requirement that you have someone banging the drum on all this stuff, because it's the only stuff he listens to. It's the only reason that he'll change course is when he's getting beaten up over something, right?
And they must feel that and all the people around him who are, the ones who see this as an opportunity to make some cash need to feel like, hey, there is, the cop's on the beat a little bit, right? Like,
exactly.
They're not there in full force, but they're on the beat. They're taking notes. They're whatever it is. the camera, the red light camera is there. And
exactly. Someone can see us.
Let's talk a little bit about that. The small business, the Paycheck Protection Act. This is there's $350 billion, and this is one of the big knocks about the stimulus more broadly. There's $350 billion there where small business can go and they can go to a local banking facility. They can get a loan for the first 10 weeks. If they spend all that money, if they spend within the first 10 weeks, if they spend all that money on payroll and rent, more or less, then that will be forgiven. It's more or less like a grant in a way to make sure that people are continued. They're paying their people basically to stay home. And which is a good idea. In fact, it's similar to what they did in Denmark. Although in Denmark they did about 90% of, like, they did it for everybody. And the problem is that they were supposed to start handing out those loans today. No lending facilities are prepared because it's hard to know if this is like the most efficient government could get this out, or if this is just like a uniquely degraded government apparatus that we have after 3 years of, destruction of the administrative state in this administration.
I think it's both, right? I think like an unprecedented challenge is coming up against a degraded government to create the worst possible scenario. So, the program design wasn't necessarily like as much as you cannot trust the banks at all. The idea was to push this through the banks because they have pre-existing relationships and because the Small Business Administration does not have the capacity to process $350 billion in loans. Like they're like this little tiny adjunct part of the government. And so to give them $350 billion, the idea was like, no, let the banks do the lending and then we'll just backstop it. But then the banks are like, well, we don't want to lend. Part of the problem here is like banks are thinking like banks as opposed to aid organizations, right? So the idea is like, we don't fucking care if these people are creditworthy. Give them the money. Like, that's the point. And the banks are like, wait, but like, what if they can't pay it back? It's like, no, that's the point. Stop.
Right.
Like, talk. The banks are like trying to do like, they're now doing like their due diligence and they're like trying to be bankers and lenders. And it's like, no, just write them the checks. We'll handle it on the back end. Write them the checks. And here's the other thing about this that's really screwed up that I just realized last night. And I don't think anyone has quite figured this out yet. I think we're going to do it on the show tonight. There's actually like a very fundamental design flaw between two different parts of the bill that are now at cross purposes. So one of the options we had was, do we go the Denmark-French solution, which is the government pays businesses not to fire people and keep them on payroll, right? That was like, that's what you're talking about with Denmark. That was like one of the sort of European models. The other was, it might be too late for that and we might not be able to administer that. So what if we just beef up unemployment insurance, right? The problem is that we've done both. So we've beefed up the unemployment insurance, which is good because 7 million people have been fired. But then we're telling these small businesses that a lot of them have already laid people off. You can only get paid back if you keep people on. But then they're like, wait a second, I fired these people and they're getting more money from unemployment insurance than I can pay them.
Right.
So we now have set up, and again, I don't think this is like an intentional flaw. I think it was basically like the thing got thrown together and there were these two ideas and it was kind of like, let's try both. But the problem is they are in tension with each other at a fundamental incentive level. So we have now created a system where one part of the bill is fighting the other part of the bill. See what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case, although I'm not sure the sequencing is right. I mean, I think it's basically like the real problem is they got this out the door too slow. And
right, but the problem is that the problem is the UI. Here's the problem. The problem is there's a lag because all these people have already fired all these people, right?
Right.
Like,
so you have probably right now.
Like, I can't. I don't have a business. I don't have a bar. I can't like keep paying you when I have to like. So they're already fired, and now it's like, well, you get this loan if you keep your payroll. It's like that ship has sailed, dude.
Well, I think the question is for how many? How many? I mean, we don't know. We're talking 12 million people have been laid off. We don't know what that number in $350 billion. I don't think it's going to cut it, frankly. Like you're basically stopping the bleeding of companies that are, could sustain 4 weeks, but they can't sustain 8 weeks, right? Like that's who this is targeted to. Like the people who have laid off all those workers at this point, they're keeping some people on maybe in some instances, or they've completely shut down. But 8 weeks from now, they're done, and it's almost like there are different, I think there is that tension is definitely there, but I think it's sort of like, we're willing to, it's the same attitude they have with everything else. Yeah, 100,000 people die. We got off easy. Yeah. And I think that's their attitude towards, the first line of those businesses that are basically like, you're out of luck. You're not going to stay around because
it's kindling for a fire of discontent.
Oh my God.
It's if you thought Camp was bad,
no, absolutely.
These are all going to be Republicans.
Right. And
it's like, they're like small, it's like you got to own the car dealership.
Well, the car dealership, that's the thing, is for businesses that are, it depends on what their cash flow situation is, it seems to me. Yeah. And how quickly this gets out the door. But they should have just, they're doing this cosplay with the banks. And this is the other thing that all of this is revealing. One of the problems with the stimulus is not just, it seems to me, the enormous amount of money that they're giving to these major corporations. The other part of the problem with the stimulus is that the money flows out the door much easier to them because there's already a built-in apparatus to get them the money. And we don't have that in terms of healthcare. We don't have that in terms of aid, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Real problem. All right. Well, Chris, I know you got to jump.
I'm going to hop off because I want to have an editorial meeting now that I'm all hyped up about this.
All right.
We'll check back in on your still. I want a still update next time I come on.
Okay, will do. All right. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. Take it easy. Bye-bye.